From Mark 10, verses 2 through 16. Some Pharisees came, and to test him they asked, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife?" He answered them, "What did Moses command you?" They said, "Moses allowed a man to write a certificate of dismissal and to divorce her." But Jesus said to them, "Because of your hardness of heart, he wrote this commandment for you. But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate." Then in the house the disciples asked him again about this matter. He said to them, "Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery." People were bringing little children to him in order that he might touch them. And the disciples spoke sternly to them. But when Jesus saw this, he was indignant and said to them, "Let the little children come to me. Do not stop them. For it is to such of these that the kingdom of God belongs. Truly I tell you, whoever does not receive the kingdom of God as a little child will never enter it." And he took them up in his arms, laid his hands on them, and blessed them. This is the word of God for the people of God.
I really don't want to do this morning. I really don't want to do this morning, but I looked at the lesson and I go, oh my gosh. I hate talking about family values because they're so controversial. None of us have the same feeling about them. And there's no consensus about what is good, healthy family values and what isn't. And as a result, we have this culture war that's in our country that's just, I think it's stupid myself, but it is what it is, and we have this whole debate about so many things. And furthermore, when I came here a year and 3 months ago, the one thing that I was told when I came here by a couple people was, whatever you do when you preach, be careful about divorce. Because Gary preached a sermon on divorce that got some people upset. And heaven pray, we don't want people upset. Of course, the thing about it is, I've already upset people. And you just don't go through life without upsetting people. And I feel bad about that because, you know, I would like to think we should be able to have a place where we can talk about things like this. And if there's any place, it ought to be a place where we can talk about things like our family and how it ought to be put together and how we respect family choices and all that kind of stuff. It ought to be the local church. But it doesn't seem to work out that way because there's always this attitude that there's one right way of doing it. And furthermore, the faith community in America just... You know, we're just sort of all over the place on this. If you look at Christianity in America, there are three major expressions of Christianity in America. There are more than three, but there are three big ones. Roman Catholicism, mainline Protestantism, and evangelical Protestantism. And when you start talking about family values in terms of these three traditions, we don't get along on this one. We don't. We get along on a lot of things, but we just don't get along on this one. There was a consensus, I think, at one time. Maybe up to around World War II and shortly afterwards. I remember as a child, and as a young, I don't know, as a child, really as a youth, I was pretty active in the church. My parents were pretty active in the church. I grew up in the church. The church was our home. And a little controversy broke out when Bishop Ensley was bishop. Some of you who've been around a while might remember that name. And he had a rule that any pastor who got a divorce had to leave. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. They had to leave. And what the controversy was, the church, the next Methodist church down from, in the next area, suburban community in which we lived in Columbus, had a delightful pastor who was greatly loved, and his marriage came undone. And Tom had to leave. And everybody liked Tom. And the congregation went to the bishop's office, and they stood outside the door of his office waiting for the bishop to speak to them. And he didn't want to speak to them. Finally, he came out and he said, "I have my rules. This is the way it is." And then Bishop Ensley retired, and we got Bishop Loader. And then the rule changed a little. If you were a pastor who got divorced, you had to leave unless your spouse filed for divorce. I thought that was a little cheesy. Relationships don't come apart because one person's right, the other person's wrong. But that's how he did it. So if you could throw your spouse under the bus, you could keep your job, essentially. And but at least it was a little movement in terms of being sensitive to people who are struggling with this issue. Meanwhile, our friends in our Roman Catholic traditions and our friends in the evangelical traditions were pretty much knuckled down on this one and saying, this is just not going to happen. And our Roman Catholic friends began to develop this whole concept of annulment. And we won't allow divorce, but we will allow you to annul your marriage. And there's a long process. And I've talked to priests about it. And they say it's a process it will lead to healing and all that kind of stuff. But it's a process. And you cannot take the sacrament until you've gone through it. And it was nice to hear Pope Francis say, we're going to try to streamline that process and make it less expensive. Because it is a very expensive process. And of course our evangelical friends, they're pretty literal about lots of things, and if Jesus says we shouldn't be doing this, we're not going to do it. And so here you have the mainline Protestant churches, our tradition, beginning to find a little wiggle room in this whole conversation about divorce. Then Bishop Loader retired, and then we got Bishop Ammons. And lo and behold, Bishop Ammons was divorced and remarried. So all of a sudden, just like that, there is some space to talk about this. And that's when we talk about family values. The healthy approach, I think, is to give people space, because not all of us experience life and relationships in the same singular way. At the same time, we have Jesus teaching here that we got to listen to. And I think I've shared with you some readings I've been doing by a rabbi about the right hand and left hand of God. And the church does well. And, the right hand of God in Jewish thought is the need for us to live a righteous, God-centered life. And the left hand of God is the need for us to be merciful and compassionate and understanding. And the thesis of this book is that whenever the church lives out of just one of the two hands, the church becomes crippled. It's no longer able to do its work. It's no longer able to be a transformative body in the lives of people. And his argument is that in the last 40, 50 years, the conversation about religious life in America has become so centered on the right hand of God that the merciful, compassionate, and understanding aspects are getting lost. And I think he's right on that. I think that's why the church is in a lot of trouble today. We have a whole lot of Jerry Falwells out there, and he's gone now, worrying about whether or not cartoon characters are homosexual or not. It's just crazy the stuff I see my colleagues writing and talking about in the public sphere. And it just alienates so many groups of people. And there's very little compassion in a lot of that. And so I think what I like about our faith tradition is we've been trying to deal critically with both the right and left hand of God. We don't always do it very well because I know a story. I always know lots of stories about this. But when you don't have the left hand of God, that compassion, that mercy, that understanding. About a dozen or so years ago, when I was at Dayton, a young couple came to me to get married in my church. They were actively involved in one of these independent, non-denominational congregations that did a lot of this praise and contemporary music that a lot of people like. I'm not putting it down, it's just a lot of people like that, and they were sort of attuned to that. As I got to meet with this young couple, I began to notice something. They both wanted a very traditional wedding. They wanted traditional hymns sung in the wedding. They knew exactly what they wanted. And at one point I stopped and asked them, I said, tell me, why are you here? Why don't you go to your church where you're a member and that you're very actively engaged? And they said, well, for our wedding we wanted something traditional. We wanted something that resonates with a lot of who we are. And then they proceeded to tell me the story. She was Roman Catholic and he was Methodist. And the Roman Catholic said to me, you know, I just can't do Roman Catholicism anymore because I have all these painful memories in Catholic education where the nuns would smack my knuckles with the ruler when I didn't get things right. I've heard about that. I don't know how true it is, but she said it was, and she says, I can't go there anymore. And the young man who was picking specific hymns out of our hymnal that he wanted in the wedding, he was a music guy and loved music, and he said, well, the reason why we like your church because it looks traditional and it is traditional. But the reason I left the Methodist Church was that when I was 11 years old, my parents went through a divorce. And during Sunday school one day, the door opens up and it's the pastor. And he takes me by the hand and leads me out of this classroom and told him never to come back again because they didn't think it was right for him to be in his Sunday school. And the thing about it is, I know pastors who would do that. So I know it's true. I know he wasn't making that up. And he said the one thing that the Methodist Church gave him as a child that he really liked was these hymns. And he doesn't get to sing them where he goes to church anymore. And I just felt so bad. How easy we throw people away because they don't fit into our expectation of what is a faithful lifestyle. They don't fit in to our expectation to what we legally believe is right or wrong. Now, Jesus does say that divorce is wrong, but you got to read carefully. You got to read carefully before you jump to any conclusions. And this is my problem with biblical literalists. They just sort of take everything at face value and then they cram it down your throats. And they create all sorts of problems for people, and so all of a sudden they feel alienated from their faith family. And if you look at what Jesus says carefully, and if you understand the culture in which Jesus is living and working, there's some interesting things about his teaching here. At the time Jesus was living, if a man wanted to divorce his wife, all he had to do was go to the center of town and announced 3 times, "I am divorcing my wife." And when he got home, she better be gone. A woman didn't have a right to divorce her husband. None whatsoever. 0, zip. The power differential in a whole conversation around divorce in the first century was so out of bounds, it wasn't even funny. And when women had to leave, they had to leave and they got no support. And sometimes they ended up having to be beggars or go into prostitution and things like that just to survive. And so in one aspect, I think Jesus is commenting on the unfairness of the system. It was unjust and unfair. And as the system was, it was an abomination. The second thing that Jesus says in the midst of this conversation is something I think is really interesting. Fairness and justice aside. After he makes his proclamation, he says, "What God has joined together, let no one separate." Now, I'm the kind of guy who likes wiggle room. When I first started preaching back in the early 80s on a regular basis, I was in this little church in Anna, Ohio, and I had a person in my church who was sharp as a tack. And after about a couple months there, he come up to me and he said, "You preach with a back door." I said, "What do you mean?" He says, "You preach with a back door. You will get us to the point where you tell us where the gospel wants us to be, and then you give us all a back door to escape that." And he said to me, "You're never going to make it in the church by doing it that way." And I've thought a lot about that over the years. And I think Dale was right. I like a back door. I like the idea of having a way to think about something, and if I'm not quite ready to be there yet, I can back off. I think it's called grace, but I may be wrong on this. Well, Jesus put a back door into this conversation. And it's this, the back door is what God has joined together, let no one separate. What God has joined together, let no one separate. And why this is a back door is this. What is the object? What happens when God is in the midst of something? What is the outcome of the encounter with the holy? When God does God's work, what is left in the wake? And you all know what the answer to that is. Love, grace, fulfillment, a sense of wonder, a sense of belonging. What God has joined together, what is left? But wonder, a sense of belonging, love, grace, a sense that our lives are being made full. I don't assume that every marriage is a marriage that necessarily has God's fingerprints on it. I would hope that every marriage has God's fingerprints on it. That's the difference between Protestants and Catholics. Catholics see marriage as a sacrament, which means God has done this. So therefore, God's fingerprints is all over the marriage. So that's why divorce cannot be ever faithful, because God has made it so. But Protestants see marriage as a rite, an R-I-T-E, a rite, that has the potential of sacramentality. Just because I say the magic words and the couple standing before me doesn't necessarily make it so. We know a whole lot of things about human beings. We know that our adult personality doesn't really finally get cemented until we're in our mid-20s. We know that that part of our brain that tells us what is right and wrong and gives us a sense of value, it gets an understanding of meaning and purpose, does not get fully formed until your early 20s. We know that sometimes we make choices that we ought not make. We know that we're fallen. And sometimes our judgment gets a little skewed. And so two people may come together and get married. Are God's fingerprints on that? Or is this just the rash of passion and the work of the moment and all that kind of stuff? I felt that romantic love was God's practical joke on human beings. Because, you get all excited and then something starts to, over time, drain. And that's when we know, when it starts to drain, whether or not God's fingerprints are on the relationship. So do we condemn people to stay together when there is no love, there is no grace, there is no wonder, there is no joy, there is no sense of belonging? Just because two people get married, does that mean God has brought them together? And so I think Jesus gives us a little wiggle room on this. So if we've had to struggle through the pain of that, and I've never met anybody that's gone through divorce that did it eagerly, joyfully, playfully, dismissively. It is a gut-wrenching, painful experience that requires from us, the faith community, some grace and understanding. Some grace and understanding. And I think this is true about not only this issue, but every issue with family values. Up until World War II, the nuclear family was not the primary way of understanding family. It was extended family. You all remember the show The Waltons? People either lived in one big house or they lived in neighborhoods that they could be there for each other. Then after the Second World War, we all got this crazy idea that a husband and a wife and their kids could go off and live far away from the rest of the family and make it. I'm not sure that's the wisest way of doing it. It's a family value we as a culture hold today. We really do. I see little babies and I tell the parents, hold on to that kid, love that kid, because when you bat your eye, next thing you know, she'll be driving a car, you bat your eye again, they'll be getting on airplanes and find exotic places like Phoenix to spend the rest of their lives. And so then you'll be just hanging on to those phone calls and those Skypes. But that's contemporary family values. The nuclear family, we all courageously go off in our own little cluster and just do our thing. That's, in the history of humanity, that's the new thing. And so people start preaching about family values. I'm not so sure some of those family values that we want to eschew and celebrate are necessarily working today. And I'm not so sure other people who experiment with different kinds of values that might work for them should be dismissed. That's all. I think we need a little wiggle room. A little wiggle room with each other when we deal with family values. A little acceptance, a little grace. That's all I have to say about the divorce thing. And if I've upset anybody, don't get mad and go home and complain about it. Give me a call. Let's talk about it. I am so tired of the anger in our culture where we can't talk about anything. People blow up and make their proclamations known and they stamp out. Nothing ever gets resolved or fixed. You just need to give people space to let their faith in God and the church's guidance allow a path to emerge. Know that you are loved in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.